In this video, we'll take a look at using custom models in BabylonJS. Importing custom models is one of the first things people want to learn how to do. First, we use a realistic looking barrel that has PBR textures. This relatively low poly object is a great example of a prop that you might use in your own scene. Ensuring your model is properly set up to be used within Babylon is critical, and for this we'll spend some time in Blender. Within Blender, we'll discuss the coordinate system differences, naming conventions, and how to properly export out a GLB file. We'll repeat this process with a more complex scene that has multiple meshes and some quick ways of verifying that your model will work within Babylon. So with that said, let's get started. Okay, so here we are in Visual Studio Code. I created a class called Custom Models, and in this class I added in some starter code that comes from the Basic Scene class and the PBR class. So those are classes that we covered in previous videos. And in here we can see that we have a few new changes. So first off, I did implement the camera speed just like before, 0.25. I added in the environment texture. We'll be using environment lighting for some of these models. Then I included that in here for the scene and also the default skybox. I reduced the environment intensity down to 0.5. We can play around with that once we actually start importing models. And then I included just the ground. So I have the ground that's using the asphalt material from a PBR video that we covered. So all that is the same as before. And we're just going to be modifying this to include our new custom models. So the models that I'm going to be using actually come from a few different places. The first model comes from Polyhaven. So let's take a look at the models we're going to be using. All right, so once again, we're going to go back to Polyhaven. We use Polyhaven for the textures and HDRIs that we're using. Now we're going to take a look at the models. Now, if you take a look at these models, these are fairly high quality, but as you can probably surmise, a lot of these are going to be very high poly. High poly is not good when you're talking about performance. So we're not building a PC game or anything of that sort. We're building a browser game. So we need to make sure that we're using lower poly models. Now, the model that I want to use here is this one right here, the Barrel01. Now, this one is not that high poly. If we take a look at the second image here, you can see it's fairly low poly for the most part. We have a lot of detail in here, which is great, but it is fairly low poly. So we get that nice combination of something that looks realistic, but is still performant. So this barrel has some really great textures if you take a look around. And this is PBR, so we can use this with our environment lighting to create something that looks very realistic. If you take a look at the 3D section here, we can take a look at this and how this would look like with our environment lighting. So it is fairly realistic. We can see some nice details. And this will be a good representation of how we can use a realistic looking model in Babylon. So we are going to be using this, but first I want to start off by looking at this in Blender. So if we take a look in the top right here, I'm using a 2K version, and I'm going to download this as a blend file. A blend file is going to be used with Blender. So you can download this, and if you want to use Blender and follow along with this, you can download it at blender.org. Blender is a 3D application. It's very popular. It's open source, it's free, and it's available for Windows, Mac, and Linux. This is my go-to tool for anything 3D related. So I'm going to be using version 2.93 for this. So we're going to open up the blend file now, and we'll take a look at this. Okay, so once you extract all the files out of the Barrel01 2K blend, you should see something that looks like this. So you're going to have your textures. Then you're also going to have a blend file. So if you have Blender installed, you can double click it to open it up. I do have this opened up already, so let's take a look at it. Okay, so here we are in Blender. You should have something that looks like this in your blend file. So we have the model. And if you don't see the materials like this, you can click on this icon right here. This will allow you to actually visualize the materials, but it should be set up as such. Now, there are three main things that I like to look for when I'm going to export this out to use in Babylon. First off, you want to make sure that the position, rotation, and the scale of this object are all normalized. So we have a value of 0 for the X, Y, and Z for the location, same thing for the rotation. And then for the scale, you want to make sure these are set to a value of 1. A lot of times you'll see that things are moved around. You have different values for, say, the location, rotation, or the scale. And if you export that out to Babylon, you may run into some issues. So in general, if you do want to save what you have in here, wherever that's at, let's say you move it over here, you readjust the scale or you readjust the rotation. If you want to save those changes, hit Control A in the window here. So Control A, and you can apply the location, rotation, and scale, or do this all at once, or just the rotation and scale. Okay. In my case, that has already been set up for us, so we're not going to worry about that. That's one thing to keep in mind with these models. Another thing I like to look at is the naming of the meshes. Now, in this case, they did a great job of naming this exactly what it is. So we have barrel01, we have the mesh, and then the material is also named barrel01. So that's important because if you need to reference this in your Babylon scene, you want to make sure that you have it named properly. So a lot of times you'll see that very large projects have a lot of objects that have a basic naming structure. What I mean by that is in here, if I were to say recreate this barrel, I'll start off by creating a cylinder. I'll do that by hitting Shift A on my keyboard. I can then add a mesh. And if I add in a cylinder, you can see it's named cylinder over here. If I were to recreate that barrel, but I don't rename it over here, and I have multiple barrels in my scene, I may not know which is which. So I always recommend renaming your meshes. I'm going to delete this guy right here. Okay, so you can see in this case, we do have the barrel renamed, and same thing for the material. So the third thing I take a look at is the material. Down here, we can see what the material actually looks like. And in general, if I can recreate this same material inside of Babylon, then more than likely that material will also work. So let's take a look at what we have in here. So if you're not familiar with Blender, let's just go over a brief overview of the nodes in here. So by default, we have the principled BSDF. This is basically our PBR node for our material. And you can see here we have a base color that's connected to this guy up here, which is an image texture. And if I hover over it, you can see this is a diffuse. So we have used that with a PBR material in Babylon, so that is going to work. Same thing for the metallic, same thing for the roughness, and also the normal. So all these textures should work just fine inside of Babylon. Now over here on the far left, we have some mapping nodes. This is basically the UV scaling of the texture. Again, that will work just fine inside of Babylon. Okay, so I think everything has been set up properly. We can just export this out now. I want to export this out as a GLB file. A GLB file is fairly small, and it's going to be very performant when we use it with Babylon. So let's go up to the very top here. Let's go to File, Export, and go down to where it says GLTF 2.0. You can see we have GLB in there. Okay, and in my case, I'm going to go ahead and save this same file in the same directory as where this blend file is located. Let's take a look at some of the settings over here. So first off, make sure that the format is set to GLTF. In my case, I'm using .glb. Let's open up include. Now, since we're only working with one object, I can just export out everything in here. But there may be times where you want to select specific objects, and we'll take a look at that with our next model. But for now, we'll leave this all unchecked. This next section is important. We'll take a look at this a bit more with the next model, but you always want to have this checked on. It is checked on by default, but if you uncheck this, it is going to cause issues because the coordinate system inside of Blender is different than the coordinate system inside of Babylon. In Blender, the z-axis is up, but in Babylon, the y-axis is up. So this basically allows us to convert that and say, hey, I want to use the y-axis as the up axis whenever we export this out. Next, we have the geometry. In this case, I want to uncheck vertex colors. I'm not using that, so we can uncheck that. I do want to have the UVs and normals checked on. And down below here where it says materials, make sure that is set to export. Now, compression is great if you want to improve the performance of this model. In my case, it's just a single model, so I'm not too worried about this. Lastly, we have our animations. I'm not actually using animations at all, so I can uncheck all of these. If you want to save your settings that you have right now, you can click on Remember Export Settings right here. I'm just going to leave this unchecked for now. Close that up, and I'm going to rename this to barrel.glb. Okay, so it already has the file name already attached to it, so barrel, and then export. Now you'll see that little black box appear. Once that's done, it should have exported out properly. Once you export this model out, I don't like to jump straight into the code. Instead, I want to make sure that this model actually works in Babylon. So Babylon does have a great tool called the Sandbox, which allows you to visualize these models very, very easily. So let's take a look at that next. Okay, so here we are at sandbox.babylonjs.com. So we can drag in these different file types in here. We're going to be using the GLB type. So let's drag in the file. So that's going to be the barrel here. If I hover over it, this is the GLB file. It is 15.3 megabytes. We'll drag this in. Okay, there we go. Now we can see what our model looks like. Now the Sandbox does have some preset settings. So you will see that we have this skybox that is the environment lighting. I can take a look around. So the camera does have controls. and it zooms into the middle of this object. So you can't actually go through it. You can take a look around, get a good close-up of it. And if you want to see more details about this object, you can go down here into the inspector. So click this icon, and I can go into the nodes. And we have things like the barrel here. So if I don't want to see that, I can turn it off. I can go into the materials. I can go into the texture, so on and so forth. Now we'll take a look at this a little bit more later on. But now I know that this will actually work just fine in Babylon. Let's jump back into the code and start using this model. Okay, now to save on time, I did already include this in my public folder. So public models, you'll see that we have the GLB file in there for the barrel. I also have the Campfire one, which we'll be going over in a moment. So we want to use this in our code. Now, before we can actually use any kind of models, any kind of 3D models, we need to actually include a new package. This is a loaders package, and it will allow us to actually load custom models in our scenes here. So I'm going to go and stop my server, and I'll type out npm install, and we're looking for the @BabylonJS /loaders. Okay, npm install @BabylonJS loaders. Okay, let's just verify that this has been imported properly. So if we go to package.json, you should see the BabylonJS core right here and the loaders below that. Okay, I'll close this up. I'll rerun the server. So npm run serve. All right, and then back in our custom models, right below the BabylonJS core import, I'm going to import the loaders. So I'm going to say import, and I'm just going to say @BabylonJS core loaders, just like that. All right, we're going to jump down and we're going to create a new method for importing our barrel. Okay, so we're going to call this method create barrel. To import a model, there are different ways of doing this inside of BabylonJS, but they are very, very similar in terms of how they work. So I'm going to be focusing on one method. That's going to be the import mesh method. There are a few ways of using this as well. So we're going to start off with the first version, and then the second version is going to be an asynchronous version. So in here, what we're going to do is we're going to use something called a scene loader. So scene loader dot, and then we're looking for import, and we have import mesh and import mesh async. We're going to start off with the import mesh first. We'll take a look at using import mesh async in a moment. So with the import mesh, first off, we provide the mesh names. So with the mesh names, you can specify which meshes from that file you want to actually import into your scene. In our case, I want to import everything. So if you want to import everything, just leave this as an empty string. Next, we need to provide the root URL. Now this is different than how we did this with the textures. This is just the path to where that object is located. So going back into our public folder, we have public models and then barrel.glb. So the path is going to be /models. Okay, make sure you add in that slash at the end there. Next, we need to provide the file name. So the file name is going to be barrel.glb. Next, we need to add this to our scene. So this.scene. After that, we then need to provide a onSuccess. Now, you don't really need to provide this, but I will if you want to access stuff within the mesh. So I'm going to add in a arrow function in here. And all I'm going to do in here is console out something called meshes. I'm going to say meshes, meshes. Now, obviously, meshes has not been defined here. We provide that in the callback. So I'll say meshes. Now let's go back in here. If I hover over the callback and I add in a comma here, I can see all the different properties that I can assign or all the different arguments I can assign to the onSuccess callback. So the first one is an array of abstract mesh. So these are going to be all the meshes included in that file. The second one is our particle systems, skeletons, animation groups, so on and so forth. So we can access all this stuff from the onSuccess callback. In my case, I just want to access the meshes and that's it. So I'll remove that comma. Go ahead and save this. Make sure that we do call the create barrel in our constructor. So below the create ground, create barrel. Go ahead and save that. Okay, so there is our model, and we can take a look around in here. We can see that the environment lighting is working just fine. The textures look great. And as you can see, it's in the center point of our scene. Now, let's take a look at the console message I wrote out. So if you're in Chrome, you can right click in here and go to inspect and take a look at the console. And in the console, we have our console message, meshes, and meshes is an array. Now, the way this works is that the array of meshes always starts off with a 0, which has the root object. So if we expand this out a bit, the ID and the name are both underscore root. Now, root you can think of as a container for all the meshes. This will always be displayed with any mesh that we import. So no matter what we import, it's always going to have a root object. Now, this is very useful because if you want to have, say, an entire scene scaled down to a much smaller size, you don't want to have to go into each individual mesh and then scale them down. You can just do this along the root mesh. Same thing if you want to reposition or rotate something and you want to do it all at once, you can just do that with the root mesh. Now, in the array, we also have a 1 in here. This is actually the one mesh that we have with this model. So there is barrel_01. This is why it's important to have names for your meshes, because now I can reference this by its name or its ID. If this was named, say, cylinder.001, and there's another one called .002, I would have no idea which is which. So it's very important to rename your meshes and even your materials if you want to reference them within your code. All right, so we have our meshes array. We have our barrel in here. Let's adjust the environment lighting. It is looking a little bit dark in here. And then we're also going to take a look at how we can utilize the asynchronous version of this method. Okay, so going back into our code, let's jump down into the environment intensity. This is in my create scene. I'm going to bump this back up to 1. And then in the create barrel, I now want to use the asynchronous version of this method. So I'll leave this in here, but I'm going to comment it out. Now, since we are going to be using an asynchronous version of the scene loader import mesh, what I'm going to do here is set up the create barrel to be asynchronous as well. So we'll type out async. It's going to complain because we're not using a promise type here. So I'll say promise, add in my angle brackets. I'm not returning anything, but we need to set up a promise that says void. Okay, so now let's use the asynchronous version of the import mesh. And for this, I want to store this in a variable called models. So const models, and again, we'll do the same thing as before, but remember we're using an asynchronous version of this. So we're going to await the scene loader dot import mesh, and I want to use the import mesh async. This will be very similar to the other version. The only difference is that we don't have the on success callback. We have an on progress if you want to use that, but we're not going to use that. We're just going to use the 3 options up here. Okay, so mesh names, any. I'll leave that empty since I want to import everything. The root URL, again, is going to be .models. The file name is also going to be barrel.glb. And then we can add it to the scene if we want to. I'm not going to provide that. I'm just going to leave that as is. All right, so this should do the exact same thing as before. I want to console out the models and see what we get from that. Okay, so console.log models, and I'm going to pass in models, which is the variable that we created. We'll save this real quick and let's take a look at what we get. Okay, so the environment lighting is much brighter now. It looks much better. And again, we still have the same barrel as before, but now we're using the asynchronous version of this. Let's take a look at our console. Okay, so in a console, we have the models object. And if you notice, all these properties here are the same properties that we had in the on success options. So we have the animation groups, lights, meshes, so on and so forth. What if I just want to reference the meshes? I could say models.meshes, but there is a better way of doing that. So let's close this out. Let's go back into our code. Instead of grabbing everything from the import mesh async, what I want to do here is use some destructuring. So to destructure, we add in our curly braces here, and then you type in the name of the property that you want to use. So I just want to grab the meshes from whatever we get out of the import mesh async. Let's make sure that we rename these down here. So this will be meshes as well. Okay, once again, let's make sure that we take a look at the console and see if we actually get our meshes. So there we go. Now we have our meshes array just like before. So the 0 in the array is the root. And then the second one, which is 1, is going to be the barrel_01. Okay, great. So everything is working as intended. Now let's take a look at a much bigger scene. So far we've just been using this one barrel. Now let's take a look at adding in multiple objects and how we can use this within Babylon. So I'm going to be using some assets from a place called Kenney. So Kenney has some really great assets here. These are free to download. This is the asset pack we'll be using, but I did create a blend file that contains a scene using some of these 3D models. So I will provide that blend file in the code repository. I'm also going to be providing the GLB file of the completed scene as well. So let's take a look at this in Blender. All right, so here we are in Blender. You can see I created this scene using the survival assets. And the great thing about these assets is that they are fairly low poly, and you can see that they don't actually use any kind of textures. These are all based off basic colors. So this will be fairly performant for our Babylon scene. Now, there are a few things I want to mention about this. So first off, I did create a collection called Campsite. Whenever you start working with more and more objects, you always want to group them together based on what they are. In my case, I just grouped together all the assets that we have here into their own collection called Campsite. I do have a camera and lights collection as well that I've turned off. So I don't want to export these out, so I included them in their own collection. I can then turn them off and not actually export them out at all. Now, the models that I use in here actually have a parent object. So you can see TMP parent, and you can see that we have a lot of these. So if I was just referencing the parent objects, it would be very difficult for me to know which is which. But the good thing about these is that all the individual models underneath that actually have real names. So we have Rock B, we have Resource Wood, so on and so forth. So that's very good. Same thing for the materials. So you can see we have here a wood material. It does say .004, but it does say wood. So I'm perfectly fine with that naming structure. Now, since all of these materials are using basic colors, I don't have to worry about whether or not this is going to work inside of Babylon because it is going to work. The most important thing I want to take a look at with this particular scene is the orientation. So the coordinate system that we use in Blender is going to be different than Babylon, like I mentioned before. So if we take a look at the top right now, I can see that the y-axis is pointing away from us. Now, any of these icons right here point in the positive direction. If I click on the middle of my scene here, you'll see this gizmo up here. So you need to make sure that you have this enabled with the move tool. And this shows us the arrows of the positive direction of that axis. So the red one here is the x-axis, the blue one is the z-axis, and the yellowish green one here is the y-axis. Now, whenever we're working in Blender, we always want to make sure that the x-axis is pointing to the right. The x-axis in Babylon is going to be positive along the right side. So make sure that's pointing to the right. The z-axis is pointing up in this case. We are going to convert that, but the way that we would actually export that out is by using that positive y up option when we export this out as a GLB file. Now, if we take a look at this, the way this is going to work when we export this out is that we're essentially going to rotate this. So y-axis is now going to be where the z-axis is at, and now the z-axis is going to be pointing in this direction. So when we export this out, the positive z-axis is going to be pointing in this direction. That's the direction that I want to look at with my camera inside of Babylon. Now, this is going to be a little bit confusing when we take a look at this in the sandbox, because the sandbox does have something called framing, which kind of rotates the camera around. So it's going to be a little confusing when we take a look at this in a sandbox, but it'll make a little bit more sense when we actually look at this in our code. But just keep that in mind. Whenever you use the Y up in Blender, it's going to rotate this essentially clockwise from this direction, and the Z-axis is going to be pointing in this direction. So in the sandbox, it's going to look like we're looking at it from this direction, but in our code, it'll be oriented correctly in this direction, right? So with all that done, what I want to do now is export this out, and I want to use the option to export out only what I have selected. So if I close up my campsite collection, I can then press A on my keyboard to select everything in here. Notice that I don't have the camera and lights enabled, so those will not be exported out anyways, but those will not be selected either. If I go to File, Export, again, we're going to use the same settings as before, so GLB. And this time I want to include the selected objects. If I left that unchecked and I have this all selected, it's going to say, hey, there's nothing to export out, so I'm not going to do anything at all. So make sure that you have selected objects enabled. Transform Y up should still be enabled. Geometry, uncheck vertex colors. And once again, make sure that the material section here says export. And then finally, for the animation, we can uncheck all of these. Okay, and I'm just going to save this in the Survival Kit 1.0. This is the file that I downloaded from Kenney. And I'm just going to rename it to Campfire. Okay, so it's done exporting out. I'm just going to save this real quick. And let's take a look at this in the sandbox. Okay, so this is what it looks like in the sandbox. Now, like I mentioned before, we are going to be looking at this from the back end in the sandbox, but in our code, we will actually be looking at it from this angle right here. So that's perfectly fine. But just keep that in mind if you are using the sandbox, the orientation may be a bit off, but I find that if I'm looking at it from this angle, I know that it's going to work out properly in my own code. But here I can take a look around. I can see everything looks fine. There's no issues with the meshes or anything of that sort. Okay, before we actually take a look at using this in our code, I want to go back into Blender and I want to export out another version of this where the Y up feature has not been enabled. So let's go back into Blender and let's export this out once again. Okay, so back in Blender, I still have everything selected. I'm going to export this out again, but this time I'm not going to enable the transform here of the Y up. So I'll uncheck that. And just so I know exactly what it is, I'm going to rename it to _2. So Campfire 2. And I'll export this out. Now what's going to happen here is that we're now using the coordinate system from Blender. That means the z-axis is up, the y-axis is forward, and the x-axis is to the right. Okay, so this is what the Campfire 2 looks like in our sandbox. And it actually looks like we're looking down on it. But in reality, the object is actually rotated because the y-axis was actually the y-axis in Blender that was pointing forward, but in Babylon, it's actually pointing upward. So it actually rotated it so that the z-axis is pointing forward. In that case, that means that we get this kind of look right here. So if you ever wonder what's going on with the orientation of your models and you're coming from Blender, make sure that you do have that setting enabled, right? So remember, Babylon and Blender have different types of coordinate systems. All right, let's jump back into our code and let's use the proper Campfire GLB file. Okay, so jumping back into our code, I already have the Campfire GLB file included in my models folder. For this, I'll create a new method. It'll be very similar to our create barrel, but this time I'm going to turn off the ground. So I'm going to turn off the create ground and the create barrel. I just want to see my low poly meshes. And we're going to start off by using the asynchronous version of this. So async, create Campfire. And make sure you include the promise void. Okay, so again, we're going to create a models variable. We're going to await the scene loader.import mesh async. I'm going to import everything this time. I'm also going to provide the same root URL. Okay, and just like before, I want to console out the models. Again, I'm not using meshes this time. I'm just going to use models as is. And then finally, we're going to add this at the very top in the constructor so we can call this. Okay, so going back into our front end here, we can see what it looks like. Now the camera was very close to the barrel, so it was basically right in the middle of the scene. But in our case, we're actually right in the middle of our campfire. But everything is properly orientated. You can see that we are facing the correct way. Okay, so everything looks pretty good for the most part. I do have the proper colors. It is quite bright, so we can adjust the environment intensity. These are using the standard materials, so not using PBR. So it's going to react a little bit differently than PBR. We also don't have texture, so it's not going to react as realistically. So let's jump back in. Let's adjust the environment lighting, and let's also move the camera back a bit. Okay, so going back into the create scene, I'll move the camera back a bit. Right now it's at -2. We'll set this up to a negative. Let's go with a -8. And then for the environment intensity, right now we have it set to 1. Let's bring this back down to 0.5. Okay, so there we go. Now I can walk around here. I can pretend to walk around. Some of these models are very, very large. But you can see everything looks pretty good for the most part. Okay, let's take a quick look at the console. So again, we have our object. This has all the geometries, the meshes, so on and so forth. So we have 40 meshes in this case. And again, the first mesh is going to be the root. So if I want to reposition this, I can then access the root. So let's take a look at how we can actually move this entire scene over to the right or the left. So we're going to jump back into the code. And in the create campfire, I can reference the meshes from the models variable here. So if I want to move all this to the left, I'll be using a negative value along the x-axis. We're going to say models.meshes, And remember, we want to access the first object, that is the root object, 0, so meshes 0, dot position. And the meshes 0 is a kind of like a geometry, so we do have access to the position. And I'll set that equal to a new vector 3. And I want to adjust it along the x-axis only. So for the x-axis, I'm going to set this to a value of, say, let's go with -3. I'll go with 0 for the y and 0 for the z-axis. All right, let's save this. Okay, now it's a little bit hard to tell, but you can see that it did move over. The value was actually quite low, so the camera's like right here, so you can't really tell a whole lot. Let's go back into the code and let's really exaggerate this. All right, so instead of -3, let's go with, say, a -15. All right, so now we can really tell that this has moved over to the left. Now you can do the same thing with the other individual meshes in here. So if I want to move, say, the signpost or the campfire or anything of that sort in here, I can then go in and reference that within the meshes array. So let's take a look at the inspector real quick. So going back into our models, meshes, we move the root object, which is meshes 0. But if we take a look at meshes 1, this is the grass object. So if we take a look at our scene, the grass is this ground object here. So if I want to move this around, rotate it, whatever I want to do, and not affect the rest of the scene, I can then reference meshes 1 and adjust those properties for that specific object. Okay, so there you have it. Now you know how to import custom models into BabylonJS.